Good afternoon, everybody. It's Cassandra Goldie here. I'm the CEO from the Australian Council of Social Service, and I'm delighted to have so many of you joining us for this webinar this afternoon, where we will be sharing with you the key findings from this important report that we've done on the faces of unemployment. Look, can I just firstly acknowledge that we are variously meeting on the land of the First Nations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia. I am on Gadigal country, am here in Sydney, and I know that many of you are all over the country on various parts, and so acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are participating in the webinar this afternoon. You know, the important leadership that Aboriginal communities are doing in a whole range of ways in a very difficult environment that we are currently in. As you know, the health crisis is very real, the economic challenges, the social challenges that everybody is facing. And so I just want to do a very particular acknowledgement, and again to thank you all for joining us. I just want to flag a few bits of housekeeping before we get going into some of the detail. You'll note that we have extended the webinar for an additional half hour this afternoon. With the level of interest, we thought it was important to create some opportunity for Q&A, and we'll explain for you how to do that, acknowledging that we probably won't get to hear from everybody, but we wanted to create some of that space. So the webinar will now end at 4:30 Eastern Standard Time for you. Look, I'm sure people's skills and competency on this platform, the Zoom platform, has much improved. Certainly mine has. But this particular session is organised as a webinar rather than a meeting. So only the speakers and technical support have video and audio options. Those of you who are watching and you can participate then in the Q&A session, and that will be by pressing the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen. You can upvote questions. So if there's a question that you think is important, you can upvote it by clicking the thumbs up. And you can also comment on questions that others have asked. Look, if you've dialed in by phone and you can't access the Q&A function, you can send your questions to our fabulous colleague from ACOSS, Penny Dorsch, who has been a key person in leading this collaboration from the ACOSS team. Her email is penny@acoss.org.au. And if you have any particular technical issues, please use the chat function, ask questions about those, and we'll do our very best to help you. Look, I'm really delighted to, on behalf of ACOSS, to be jointly presenting this webinar and also this important research with our partners Jobs Australia, and particularly to you, Debra, Cerasa, for your leadership in supporting this partnership. I must say, we wouldn't have planned the situation that we're in, but the timing of this research is really powerful, because I think what it will be doing is helping us to see where we were in terms of the experience of employment and unemployment prior to the hitting of bushfires and the coronavirus. And I think that'll be a really important point for us to come back to as we look to how we plan the future. And so I really want to thank Debra for your support for us doing this work together. And you'll hear from Debra in just a moment. Look, for the webinar, you'll be principally hearing from our colleagues Peter Davidson, who's Principal Advisor at ACOSS, and Peter Defteros, who is Jobs Australia Policy Analysis. Peter will be Peter Davidson, and we'll have to use their full names because even Peter D doesn't work for us, does it? Peter Davidson will be presenting to you on the report content. And there will be a Q&A session following Peter Davidson's presentation. And then Peter Defteros will be outlining the report context and to set the scene for employment services, so crucial, with another Q&A session to follow. And then both of the Peters will have a discussion about the impacts of COVID-19 on the employment landscape of Australia, what strategies have worked in the past, and what we really need now in the wake of lessons learned from the past, but also the best ideas that we've got now about how we could really do things to transform the opportunities for people affected by unemployment or underemployment. Look, so that's just hopefully a very warm introduction from me. I'm really thrilled to see so many of you joining in this discussion today. It is one we are going to stay the course on, as you know. It's a very core area of concern for us at ACOSS. I know it is for you, Debra, with all of your important network across the country. So again, thank you to all of you for joining us. I'll now hand over to you, Debra, and again, thank you for your partnership.
Thanks. Thank you, Cassandra. It is my privilege to be here, not only as the CEO of Jobs Australia, but also in relation to this project that has occurred. We had initially thought that it would be launched a little earlier than it has been, but Mother Nature had some other thoughts in mind with the bushfires, and then of course with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've all been learning to tap dance in new ways in many directions. So it's my privilege and pleasure to actually talk a little bit about the partnership background, and ACOSS and Jobs Australia have indeed had a very long-standing partnership, which includes membership of each other's organisations. And Jobs Australia supports the ACOSS events through supporting your national conference. And also we support projects such as this Faces of Unemployment. Jobs Australia has had a presence in the past on the ACOSS board as a member representative. And ACOSS utilises Jobs Australia services through our employment support and workplace relations team. Our policy relationship is really important to both organisations, taking sometimes a little bit of a different perspective or a different viewpoint representing our memberships, but always with the core values that both organisations have. We are very aligned with what the work that each other does and delivers. The Faces of Unemployment project itself has a history and background that should be shared, and the first report and undertaking was in 2018, and it started as an idea for presenting the details of unemployment across Australia. Indeed, the facts and figures behind the official employment figures was the idea that sprung and began this project. Some of the aspects of that project, I believe, because it was just quite a little bit before I commenced here, it was around what groups of people are more likely to be unemployed and what supports are available for them. And as I said, the first report was published in 2018. Last year, in conversations with Cass and Peter Davidson from ACOSS and Peter Defteros from Jobs Australia, the idea about doing a second edition was muted around, and we progressed that. And of course now today here we are to allow the two Peters to be able to talk to us about the second edition of the report. Interesting reading, fascinating reading, and very compelling, telling reading for both organisations and the work and services that we deliver. So it's my pleasure to now introduce the first Peter Davidson from ACOSS, and let him take off with the presentation. Thank you. Thank you to all involved.
Thank you, Debra. And I hope everyone can hear me clearly. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which we sit, and a special call out to the Darawal people from Botany Bay who first encountered Captain Cook 250 years ago. I read this morning that they thought the sails of the Endeavour were a low-lying cloud, and that meant the ancestors were returning to their traditional land. But those ancestors didn't seek permission, and so they were confronted by two warriors with spears. Unfortunately, Captain Cook and his crew had 30 soldiers with muskets, and so it goes. It's been a similar story ever since then. Faces of Unemployment tells the story of unemployment in 3 parts, and I'm going to whip through some slides which will later be available to you, and you're welcome, as mentioned before, to ask questions using the chat function, and we'll endeavour to answer a number of them today, but there's a lot of you there, so if you don't get an answer today, we'll endeavour to answer within the next week or so. And thanks again to Debra and Jobs Australia and to Peter Defteros for this great initiative, and to all of you for joining us. So there are 3 questions Faces of Unemployment attempts to answer. One is, who receives job seeker and youth allowance? Second is, what kinds of jobs can they get? And thirdly, what help do they need and what do they get from employment and other services? Now, a warning before we start, this is pre-COVID-19. Most of the data are from late last year. And to be honest, no one really knows what's going to happen to the labour market over the rest of 2020. But we will spend the last half hour talking about what we think might happen and some possible policy responses to that. But what this...
Peter,
yes.
Can I interrupt for a sec, please? We can see your PDF screen, not your slideshow.
Ah.
I think you might need to end screen sharing and then start it again with your slideshow.
Sorry about that. Trying again. How's that?
Perfect.
Great. Okay. And are you seeing the entire slideshow or the notes view?
The notes view.
Oh, well, we'll have to go with the notes view. Sorry about that, folks. The slideshow takes up the whole screen. But what this work shows is that many people, 800,000 of them, were already struggling to secure employment before the COVID emergency. And the message we're trying to get out right now is that we can't leave them behind now. So firstly, this is the profile of people who are currently receiving or were receiving at the end of last year Newstart and Youth Allowance Other, now called Job Seeker Payment and Youth Allowance Other. And all of this information is in the report which you've been sent. So in September 2019, most of the recipients were older, 45 years or older. About 41% had a partial work capacity, so a high level of disability amongst this group. 12% Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, 19% culturally and linguistically diverse communities, 11% single parents. All of these groups are overrepresented among people on unemployment payments. The second graph shows the share of people on Newstart and Youth Allowance who were on those payments long term, over 12 months. And this paints a worrying picture, because from the last recession in 1991, the share of recipients who are unemployed long term has risen from about a quarter to around 2/3. And so what that means is that as unemployment came down, the profile of the people who were still unemployed became more disadvantaged, which when you think about it makes sense. So the share of long-term recipients is the top red line. The grey line underneath that is the share of all recipients who were unemployed for 2 years or more, and that's almost half at the present time. Now, of course, that'll change with all the new entrants coming into the system, but in a year or two's time, long-term unemployment is likely to rise. And that's a problem because the longer you're unemployed, the lower your chances of getting off benefits and into paid employment. This graph shows the share of people who were originally on unemployment payments in 2016 who were still on those payments, who were in employment and off benefits 1 year later. And so for those, amongst those on payments for 0 to 3 months, there's a 55% chance that you'll be out of the system in a year's time. That falls to 30% if you're unemployed for 1 to 2 years, and just 12% if you're unemployed 5 years or more. And there are quite a few people in that position now. So this one shows, it illustrates one of the reasons for the rise in long-term reliance on unemployment payments, and that is welfare to work policies, which commenced under the Howard government in 2006. The idea was to shift people from pension payments where they didn't have requirements to engage in the labour market to Newstart and Youth Allowance, which was also much, much lower than the pension payment. So a lot of people took a huge financial hit in the process. And so what you see there is that if you look at the top blue line, the share of Newstart and Youth Allowance recipients who have what's called a partial work capacity, a disability, as assessed by Centrelink, has risen dramatically since welfare to work was introduced. And these are people who would have been on the disability support pension under the previous system. And as you can see, they're not really moving off Newstart and Youth Allowance. The share of recipients who have a partial work capacity has kept growing, and that speaks to the poor employment prospects of many people with disabilities. And you can see a big increase from 2013. It's because they measured it differently just last year and then worked back to 2013, so that instead of only taking account of people assessed with a partial work capacity in the last 2 years, they took account of everyone who'd ever been assessed as having a partial work capacity. And so the numbers instantly went up from about 25% to currently 41% of recipients, and many of those are older people as well. And the lower line is the share of recipients who are single parents, and you can see that went up sharply in 2012. That was when the Gillard government removed the grandfathering provisions that kept many single parents on the parenting payment single, and they were about 80,000 people were quickly moved to Newstart. When you're looking at those with partial work capacity and break that down in terms of their main impairment, there are two that dominate. One is psychological, i.e. mental illness, 42% of those with a partial work capacity. And secondly, this thing called musculoskeletal, which captures back illnesses, back problems. Amongst those with mental illness, that tends to be a younger to middle-aged population. Amongst those with back conditions, it tends to be an older population who've generally had many years of manual labour. So turning now to what kind of jobs people can get, pre-COVID. So this graph goes back to 2017, to the GFC. And the lowest red line is the unemployment rate. So it started below 5%, jumped up after the GFC in about 2008, 2009, fell a bit, rose again, and then fell very slowly. And just in the last year or so, it stopped falling. So even before bushfires and COVID, the labour market wasn't looking great. Unemployment was beginning to rise. And one of the reasons for that can be seen in the blue line just above that, which is the underemployment level, people who have a job but need more hours and can't get them. That rose a lot, especially for young people after the GFC, and it kept rising. And so there were a lot of underemployed people out looking for jobs, which kept unemployment higher than it otherwise would have been. And the people who were particularly affected by that were young people and single parents, people entering or re-entering the labour market. They couldn't get the hours they needed. They could get a part-time job, maybe 1 or 2 days a week, but often not more than that. And that's the group that is being particularly hard hit with the lockdowns now. So this graph shows the average number of job vacancies per unemployed and underemployed people. And as you can see there, before the GFC, there were about 6 unemployed and underemployed people searching for every vacancy available across the country. That shot up, it then shot up again, and it's gradually fallen, but it's an elephant curve. If you look from left to right with the trunk on the right, it started to rise again. And this was before COVID. So the labour market was weakening before COVID. And not only were there 8 unemployed and underemployed people per vacancy, there were also a lot more people who were changing jobs or entering the labour market for the first time. So there were actually about twice as many applicants for each job on average, and for low-skilled jobs, it was about twice again, around 30 per job. And you may have seen the stories about those jobs advertised by Woolies the other day, where there were, I think, 30,000 applicants for 6,000 jobs. That's how things are now. There's also been structural change going on in the labour market, which has tended to disadvantage the people we're assisting, those in the employment services system. And one of those changes is that the share of entry-level jobs, the jobs you can get with Year 12 qualifications or less, has been declining, and that's been happening for quite some time. And most of those entry-level jobs, think hospitality and retail, labouring jobs, are casual jobs. So there's quite a bit of turnover in those positions, and so people are often in and out of those jobs and then back onto unemployment payments. And the majority of them are also part-time these days, which means many people may remain on unemployment payments with a part-time job. So turning now to what helped people get to secure employment, Australia is relatively parsimonious. This graph compares the level of spending on employment assistance as a proportion of GDP in different wealthy nations. And what that shows is that we spent 0.24% of GDP on employment assistance for unemployed people, less than half the OECD average number, which was 0.52%. And I haven't shown it here, but there's also a graph comparing unemployment payment levels. And we're right at the bottom of that one, or we were before the COVID supplement was introduced. One of the main reasons Australia spends less is that we rely more on less costly job search assistance and less on more costly work experience and training programs. And up to a point, that's all very well. Job search assistance is important. If people aren't out there looking and they're not looking effectively, they won't find. But the trouble is, it's usually not enough on its own to overcome the kind of entrenched labour market disadvantage experienced by many people who are unemployed long term. So this table shows, it illustrates what kind of assistance they get. This is the annual compulsory activities for long-term unemployed people in the jobactive system. And these data are all published, though they're very slow in publishing them on the Employment Department's website, and I think I've got the link there. So amongst those required to engage in a compulsory activity, these are long-term unemployed people, 36% were in part-time employment, and that was their requirement. In many cases, they'd found that employment themselves. In other cases, the providers had found it for them. 22% received vocational training, and bear in mind, typically very short training courses, less than 12 weeks or so. 16% work for the dole, 1% voluntary work, and 3% wage subsidies for a private sector employer to take them on. And when you go to compare the employment outcomes for those people, what you find is that voluntary work and work for the dole, for those who engaged in voluntary work or work for the dole, around 1 in 4, 24 to 25%, were in employment, unsubsidised employment, 3 months afterwards. The outcomes were better for those who were engaged in vocational training. Those in part-time employment, of course, were already employed. Not that many, I suspect, transitioned into full-time jobs quickly. And amongst those who received a wage subsidy, though they were small in number, 87% were in employment 3 months later, generally with the same employer who was keeping them on. Now, those outcomes are raw or gross employment outcomes. They don't take into account the different profile of people who joined those different programs. And there are evaluations called net impact evaluations that try and measure the value added by work for the dole, wage subsidies and so on, the extent to which it increased people's employment opportunities above and beyond what they would have been. And recent studies for Australia indicate that work for the dole increased your chances of employment 6 months later by 2%, 2 percentage points, and wage subsidies by around 14%. So as you can see from that, some of the more intensive forms of assistance are more effective than others. And there's an international literature on this, which I've had the pleasure of trawling through. And this last table, and it's the last table in the report itself, shows the results. This is a meta-analysis by Card, Kluve and Weber of dozens and dozens of evaluations of employment programs. And the short story is that wage subsidies in the private sector typically had relatively strong net impacts. The increase in the chances of employment was relatively strong, around 10 to 20%. And that those impacts increased over time. However, there is a degree of selection bias or cream skimming, if you like, into those programs, and so they have to be very carefully targeted. Otherwise, a lot of money can be wasted on people who get jobs without the subsidy. With vocational training, the impacts are what I call medium, around 5 to 10 percentage points, which is actually pretty good if they're sustained over time. That could reduce the number of people unemployed over a number of years very substantially. But there's huge variation in the quality of vocational training, and what we shouldn't do is just throw everybody into the same set of cookie cutter courses. And vocational training has a greater impact over time, and it actually reduces employment impacts in the short term because you're participating in the training. And compulsory assisted job search, which is a large part of what jobactive does, has a relatively low impact, around 5 percentage points in the short term, and that declines over time. Having said that, you need to engage people in assisted job search in order to assess what other things they need, and assisted job search is one of the least expensive forms of assistance. And finally, public and community sector wage subsidies tend to have low impacts. Not many people seem to progress from those into unsubsidised jobs, but they can have an impact if you target people who are too disadvantaged, in a sense, to benefit from other forms of wage subsidies, because employers won't consider them, and if there's a strong emphasis on transitions into unsubsidised employment. And of course, everyone's needs are different, as are local labour markets, so it's vital to find the right form of help for the right people. In Australia, we think the relatively high level of long-term reliance on unemployment payments suggests that we haven't got that mix of support right, that we've underinvested in employment assistance overall. And the Employment Services Expert Panel, of which I was a member, came to a similar conclusion. And after the Q&A, Peter Defteros will have more to say about that.
Hi folks, it's Penny from ACOSS here. I'll be facilitating the Q&A sessions, so I will just jump straight in. Peter, we'll go with a question from Matilda to start off with. Matilda's asking about slide 8 and saying, can you speak more about the pattern of the red unemployment line? What's going on in the economy more broadly that has created these almost predictable spikes in unemployment?
Okay. And Penny, keep an eye on the time for me in case I've spoken for too long. Thanks. So I'll just find that slide. Can you see that?
Yep. Good.
Okay, so the spikes are partly seasonal. But what's important is the longer term trend. The big jump in 2008, and I hope you can see the years down the bottom there, was the GFC, essentially. And of course, in most other countries, it was a lot worse. In much of Europe and the US, unemployment approached 10%, as it's likely to here in the short term as well. And then there was kind of a double dip, because as you can see around 2014-15, unemployment started to rise again after falling. That has to do with the end of the mining boom. The mining boom helped tide us over after the GFC, because China was still building lots of things. And then we had a housing boom for a while, which did a lot of damage to rent levels, but it generated a lot of jobs. And that did start to reduce unemployment up until about 2017, but then from the beginning of 2019, things started to turn sour, and it was because there wasn't enough demand in the economy for goods and services, because wages weren't growing. That was the answer in a nutshell. That was a structural problem that we still haven't fixed.
Great, thanks, Peter. We'll go to our next question, which is from an anonymous attendee. Is the wage subsidy in private sector impacts broken down by years in the prior employment services contract? JSA providers could offer up to 90% of job seekers for employment wage and was delivered under a separate funding measure or pool. Under jobactive, the amounts are prescribed amounts and now forms part of the employment fund, so used less.
Yeah, sorry, I won't share the screen. I think the shift to just adding it to the employment fund was problematic, because it meant that providers have made less use of it, because it means less money available for other things if they spend it on a wage subsidy, which is relatively expensive. So wage subsidies work if you refer the right person to the right employer, but they are relatively expensive. And so I don't have data handy on what the outcomes were earlier on. I think the outcomes have been consistently pretty good, but the number of wage subsidies on offer has diminished quite a bit since it was switched across to the fund.
Thanks, Peter. We have another question. Is there a breakdown on vocational training impacts by delivery method? There's a lot of online training options now, probably more given the current situation, and potentially they're not as effective as face-to-face training.
That could well be, and the short answer is no, unfortunately, though the department probably has it. Worth asking them. But vocational training has wide-ranging impacts. There are some people who need foundational skills, such as language and literacy, and unfortunately investment in those hasn't been all that strong, and my sense is the quality of those courses has diminished, including for new migrants, and that's a problem. It's probably the case for people who are disadvantaged that if they don't have that face-to-face engagement, the outcomes aren't as good for them. And of course, the other factor is the way in which vocational training is funded, because back in the Gillard government days, when pseudo training vouchers were made available to people on a large scale without much monitoring and supervision and regulation, all kinds of shonky providers came onto the scene and the quality just tanked. And so that's something that really has to be watched if we want to ramp up vocational education and training for people. And that will be needed, I suspect, given all of the sudden shifts in the structure of employment that are happening this year.
Thanks, Peter. Another question, can you speak more about when public sector wage subsidy programs are effective? Would you consider CALD migrant refugee community members to be part of this group?
In some cases, yes. I'd say it's the people who have the lowest chance of finding employment without that kind of job. And generally these wage subsidies in community programs cover 100% of the wage. And the idea is they're additional jobs that work that wouldn't have been done ordinarily. And that's a problem in a way, because it means that they're not quite the same as a mainstream job. And so you're not getting the same work experience that you might get in the other kinds of wage subsidy schemes. But the ones that have worked best are what are called transitional jobs in the lingo. And those are temporary jobs, 6 to 12 months in a community organisation or in government, where the focus from day one is building the skills, the work experience, the connections with employers and the labour market that people will need to transition to an unsubsidised job afterwards. Because otherwise people leave that job and they're back onto benefits. And some may recall that the Keating government's Job Compact, which offered mostly public sector wage subsidies for a majority of long-term unemployed people, the quality of those jobs was often very low, and only a third of people transitioned from those jobs to mainstream jobs. And the other thing to watch is that you don't choose people for what is a relatively expensive intervention who are going to find jobs anyway. So, including amongst refugees, there are people who are quite highly qualified, and if you can find a private or public employer that's likely to be willing to give them a go and take them on afterwards, you'd go for that and a partial wage subsidy rather than this kind of scheme. This is more suited to people, for example, who've experienced homelessness, mental illness, or who've just come into the country and have a host of other barriers to employment, as many refugees do.
Okay, I think we've got time for one last question. Lisa Folks has asked, can you give us an idea of what some of the better performing employment services systems look like? What are they spending their money on? Okay,
thanks, Lisa. I think you need to look at the whole system rather than program X or program Y. And in a nutshell, what the system should do is get money into the hands of an employment services consultant or local provider who assesses an individual's need, is in touch with the local labour market, in touch with local employers and their needs, or someone else in the provider is in touch with local employers, works out a plan for that person to secure employment that isn't just your standard, in the case of long-term unemployed people, that isn't just your standard 20 jobs a month or whatever. And the money is available to invest in the assistance they need. For some it'll be a wage subsidy, for some it'll be short-term training. For others, go back into full-time education. Why shouldn't people be able to do that, especially at the present time when there aren't that many vacancies around? And with enough incentive for the provider to achieve outcomes without the performance management system driving them batty. In other words, without the performance management system forcing people to become highly risk averse and to underinvest in assistance because they're worried about whether they'll survive in a year's time. So it's those mix of things, and there are a few countries who've got this right. And I've done a PhD on the topic, and so, which I think you've read in part, Lisa. So have a look at that.
Thanks, Peter. We might move on now to Peter Defteros from Jobs Australia, who will give his presentation on the context surrounding the report. Peter Defteros?
Yes, thank you, Penny. I'm just getting it up here. How does that look?
Perfect. Thank you, Peter.
Great. All right. So I'll try and get it to, oh, here we go. That's how I do it. Okay. So just before I sort of kick off into my sort of description of jobactive and the problems with jobactive and the reform process that has been ongoing for a couple of years now already, and then start to talk about the new employment services trial that's happening. I just want to briefly touch on the case studies that featured in the Faces of Unemployment report. And as Deb mentioned earlier, the idea was to really tell people stories so that we get a better understanding of what it's like to be unemployed, and particularly long-term unemployed, because we read a lot about statistics, but it's really the personal stories that I think are the most powerful. And what the case studies have shown is that it's even before COVID-19 happened, there was a lot of people finding it really tough to get work. People like Connie, who's in a small little town or village in northern New South Wales. She's in jobactive. She returned to the labour force after being an unpaid carer for many years, and she's now been in jobactive for about 5 years. And she has very limited access to transport, doesn't have a car, there's very limited public transport, so very limited access to a labour market. She's undertaken a lot of training and upskilling, but unfortunately, and she's received a lot of support from her provider, but she's still unemployed. But fortunately, the case studies showed that with the right support and determination, and if people get the right opportunity as well, it really is possible for people to get out of long-term unemployment and get back into work. And one of the really interesting things is that the two case studies that we feature are actually people who are in disability employment services. With Dylan there, who was 28, he'd been unemployed for 11 years and had made 2,000 job applications in jobactive. His provider, he came to a new provider who delivered DES, but they also delivered jobactive. The provider thought that person, mightn't be better off in disability employment services, and they arranged for them to be reassessed. They got transferred to DES, and they even ended up on DSP. And even the great news is that they helped Dylan get a work trial, and he's now working as a manufacturing labourer. Another really positive and encouraging story was John, who's 55 and in Coffs Harbour. He had been unemployed for 2 years in DES. He was experiencing depression and low levels of self-esteem, lacking in confidence and motivation. he was given a lot of support and helped rebuild his self-esteem and confidence and motivation, and he's now working as a diesel mechanic. So that was another really positive and encouraging story. All right, so I want to talk a little bit now about jobactive, and it's quite well known. This is a chart which was in a document put out by the Department of Jobs and Small Business in 2018, and when they commenced their reform process, and they basically came clean and they acknowledged that jobactive just isn't working for long-term unemployed people, and this, a lot of this data backs up what Peter Davidson was saying earlier, and I'm not quite sure whether you can see my cursor moving around there, but you can see that about 20%, 1 in 5 people, have been in employment services for 5 years or more. About 2/3, so that's this group. All these 3 groups on the right have been in services for more than 12 months. So they're what are considered long-term unemployed. This group is called extremely long-term unemployed. And these 2 groups on the right adds up to about 45%. They've been in the service for 2 years or more. This table was from data that was put out by the department around about August of last year, and it shows that there are certain groups of people that are particularly at a greater risk of extremely long-term unemployment, which is being in services for 5 years or more. And you can see there that people with disability, they make up 28% of the whole caseload in jobactive, but they make up 52% of extremely long-term unemployed people, and that's a sort of difference of 24%, which clearly shows that they're overrepresented. And another group there that does it tough and is much more likely to end up in extreme long-term unemployment is mature age people. They make up 50% of the caseload, but they represent about 70% of all extremely long-term unemployed people. Particularly in relation to people with disability, you can't help but wonder whether there are a lot of people now going into jobactive who maybe once upon a time would have been on DSP or perhaps been in disability employment services, which picked up on that chart that Peter showed earlier about people with partial work capacity being transferred onto Newstart Allowance. And we know that in recent years it has become much more difficult, to get on the DSP, and it raises lots of questions about whether there are a lot of people in jobactive who really should be in disability employment services. So I've got here a number of problems with jobactive. A lot of these things are not new. Our members have been raising these concerns with us for many years. They also came out in a Senate inquiry in 2018, and also a lot of them were identified by the expert advisory panel that Peter Davidson was on. And the first point there is that the jobactive providers are under-resourced and they have very high caseloads. And the I Want to Work report from the expert panel revealed that on average, there's 1 employment consultant for 148 job seekers. There's too many complex rules and administrative requirements for providers. And there's also too much emphasis on managing job seeker compliance, and there's not enough emphasis on helping people to find work. So all of this regulation, administration, and mandatory requirements, it makes it much more difficult for both job seekers and providers to exercise agency and do what they need to do and be innovative, and perhaps take risks and provide a service that is tailored and individualised. So it really impacts as well on the type of relationship that exists between job seekers and providers, and it is an obstacle for people moving into employment. And as Peter indicated earlier, one of the mandatory activities, work for the dole. It has a less than optimal outcome when it comes to getting people into employment. So I've got here the recommendations from the panel, and probably in some ways Peter Davidson would be better off speaking to these, but I'll try and cover off on them. A big emphasis was giving job seekers more personal responsibility and choice and independence. So giving them more say over their job pathway plan, about the activities that they do, and also giving them more choice of their provider. One of the really interesting ideas that came out of the panel is this notion of a flexible points-based system of mutual obligation. So with that means if people do a more intensive activity, they get more points compared to a less intensive activity. So mutual obligation is still there, but there's a lot more choice about how you meet your requirements. And of course, the targeted compliance framework still remains in place in the trial, which is up and running now. Another huge recommendation is providing more help for those who need it the most, and they recommended more targeted investment of resources and time. And this investment is funded from shifting a lot of services onto a digital platform where people self-service, which I'll talk about a bit more in a moment. There's also a different payment model, which is designed to encourage, incentivize support and investment in job seekers and reward providers for getting long-term unemployed people into work. And there's a different performance model as well. So we don't, there isn't a star ratings system. And another recommendation is having licensing of providers. So providers aren't constantly sort of wondering whether they're going to get recontracted, and they're able to take much more long-term decisions and make much more long-term investments in job seekers, in their staff, and also in building relationships with local stakeholders. And a big recommendation from the panel was having 3 service streams, which are now in place. So there's a digital first stream. So that's the most job-ready job seekers who service themselves in an online platform. There's Digital Plus for job seekers who maybe need a little bit more assistance. They might need to be referred to perhaps employability skills training, or maybe get a qualification. And it's important to note that these first 2 streams, Digital First and Digital Plus, the people are not attached to a provider. So that's quite a radical sort of change for employment services. And what's happened, because that's now being implemented, is that these 2 digital streams broadly correspond to Stream A, what's currently Stream A in jobactive, which is the most job-ready cohort. And the third service stream, which is now up and running in the new employment services trial, is enhanced services, which is basically case management for job seekers who need much more intensive and tailored support from a provider. So they get support to address their vocational and non-vocational barriers to employment. Another recommendation is that model needed to be more useful for employers so that they can get better quality job matches, and also support local solutions so that local communities can be involved in developing those solutions. Whoops. Okay, so I'll touch now on the new enhanced services payment model. So the new enhanced services, which is the third of those streams I just mentioned, that's been up and running now in a couple of regions since November. The 2 regions are Adelaide South and the mid-north coast of New South Wales. And the main features of the model is instead of having sort of regular 6-monthly service fee payments, there's a larger upfront payment of $1,000, and the intention of that is to encourage an early investment in the job seeker. There's also payments for helping job seekers improve their employment prospects, and also helping them move to a more job-ready tier of servicing. There's higher outcome payments compared to jobactive for very long-term unemployed people. That's more than 2 years unemployed. And there's also a slight increase in the employment fund. And they've also got a new 20% regional loading in the employment fund. Okay, so as I mentioned, Employment Services has been up and running since November, and it's a little bit too early to tell whether it's financially viable. And in fact, the Department of Employment and Skills and Education has just announced that they're undertaking a financial review of the model to see how it's going, particularly, I guess, in the current circumstances of COVID. And we also don't know yet whether it's delivering better outcomes than jobactive. There is no data yet available really to tell us much. The job seekers also started transitioning from July last year to the digital services. So that the digital streams have been up and running for a little bit longer, but yet still the department isn't really releasing information about how that's going in terms of getting people into jobs and outcomes compared to comparative job seekers in jobactive. The members, Jobs Australia members that are delivering enhanced services have been very positive in their reports of the new employment services model. And they've talked about how it's much less prescriptive, it's much more person-centred, and there's fewer requirements to do certain things at certain times, like work for the dole after 12 months of unemployment, or employability skills training. And there's also smaller caseloads for each case manager compared to the equivalent in Stream C in jobactive. And yeah, they're basically saying that it's enabling them to build a much better rapport with job seekers, and it's being described by frontline staff as a real breath of fresh air. And they're also using different language. So rather than referring to work, the notion of work for the dole, it's referred to as a hosted work experience placement. And they're seeing much more positive engagement and willingness to participate from job seekers, which is they find very encouraging. Some of the I suppose more constructive feedback is that providers being expected to do things in a much more kind of flexible way, but they're still seeing that there are still too many complex and rigid administrative requirements, and they'd like to see some of the rules loosened even further, and that includes things like wage subsidies and wage subsidy levels and how they're funded. And it's also worth mentioning that the department's evaluation of the new employment services trial, which is what NEST stands for, sorry I didn't mention that earlier, has been disrupted by the bushfires and by COVID, and they haven't yet been able to roll out the more flexible points-based model for job seeker compliance. So I might leave it there for questions, but yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how employment services fares in the coming months, and how much of a dent it's going to be able to make in addressing those huge challenges of it really entrenched, extreme long-term unemployment in the system.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter. So we've got a few questions, but we are running out of time. So yeah. I'm just going to cut the Q&A a little bit short. Yeah. We've got a question from Chris, or more comment. He says, your comment about providers are under-resourced, very high caseloads, isn't that the provider's problem? They appear to be cost-cutting if the consultant to JS is so high.
Well, I guess there just isn't the resources there for providers to provide a more intensive service to everybody. There are 3 streams in jobactive, and streams A, B, and C. And stream C is the most intensive service for people who need the most support. the people who, so the caseloads for people who might specialise in providing Stream C services, the caseloads for those workers might be lower, but the overall model is 1 to 148, which just really impacts upon how much of a personalised service can be delivered, and that was shown up in the Senate inquiry and the reports from participants with experience of the system. You know, many of them reported that they just weren't getting the support that they needed, and that has you know, driven the reform process to instead put more people into a digital service who can help themselves, and the most disadvantaged get a much more intensive service.
Thank you, Peter. I'll just do one more quick one. This is from Pat. What is the feeling around digital only being left behind and isolated from the system?
Yeah, I mean, one of the risks that we were really concerned about early is that people get put into a digital service who maybe need to be in enhanced services and get the support they need. There is a contact centre that people can also access, which I didn't mention. So there's like a call centre people can speak to if they're in digital. But you really do need to have safeguards built into the system to make sure that people are identified and get, you know, appropriately streamed to digital to enhanced services, face-to-face support with a provider if they need it. One of the big risks with huge you know, tsunami of job seekers that are coming into the system at the moment is there just isn't the resources in Services Australia to properly assess people. So we're likely to see lots and lots of people getting put into the wrong service and not being put there, and delays before they do get streamed properly, and that will happen in the trial regions as well.
Thanks, Peter. I think we should move on now to our discussion about what employment looks like post-COVID. So I will open it up to yourself and Peter Davidson. Thank you.
Okay.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So what's likely to happen to the labour market after the lockdowns? Can we expect a large increase in unemployment and long-term unemployment? And the answer in one word is yes, and in two words, it's bad. So if you look at the RBA's projections, they're expecting GDP to fall by 6% over this year, and then rise by 6 to 7% across 2021 after the lockdowns are eased. But that's an increase in growth of 0 to 1% over 2 years, with a lot of disruption in between. So you'd have to expect that unemployment's going to rise. The Treasury expects that we'll have unemployment around 10% by July this year, and that it would have been 15% without the JobKeeper payment, which is enabling many people who've been stood down from their jobs to stay on the employer's books, and a fantastic and necessary measure from our point of view. But if those employers go broke or can't keep them on, then they'll join the unemployment queue as well. Scott Morrison has indicated we've had 500,000 job seeker payment claims over the last month or so, and before then there were around 800,000 people on the payment overall. So we're looking at a doubling probably. Will employment bounce back after the lockdowns? Well, to a degree it will. Cafes will reopen, retail will will reopen, but households and businesses will be reluctant to spend given the uncertainty. Many businesses will throw in the towel, and many people will come out of this with much higher debt and lower incomes, both businesses and households. And of course, the removal of the JobKeeper payment will of itself increase unemployment when that occurs, and that's around September, October. So there will be a need for a timely economic boost from government once the lockdowns are removed. And we think the JobKeeper payment should be eased back gradually rather than suddenly removed. And the job seeker payment, which, as you know, has been doubled, it should be permanently increased. It can't go back to $40 a day. So here are a few rather ugly graphs. This is some work done for the BCA, showing the impact on gross domestic product of a relatively quick removal of lockdowns through to lockdowns that last for 6 months on the right-hand side there. And that suggests that the economy will shrink by 20 to 30% over for much of this year, and then recover to a point where it's about 5% smaller than it was in the first place. So that's more pessimistic than the RBA. There's also some work being done by the Grattan Institute, which is worth a read because they break down in some detail who they expect will have lost their jobs and with the lockdowns. And it gels pretty much with the early data we're getting out of the ABS on who has actually lost their jobs. And essentially what Grattan is saying is around 1 in 4 workers will lose their jobs or be stood down during the lockdowns overall. And amongst young people, it's much higher, 30 to 40%. And amongst lower skilled workers, around 30%. So the people particularly affected by this downturn are not so much the manufacturing and construction workers who were hit in the early 80s and 90s. It's service industries because of the lockdowns, because of the restrictions on face-to-face contact. So, for example, in hospitality, they estimate half of workers will lose work, either be stood down or lose their jobs. In arts and recreation services, again, over 50%, and education and training and retail trade also greatly affected. So you can see straight away why it's young people and women who are most affected this time. And the trouble is, it can take a long time for unemployment to return to its previous level after a recession, and there's not much doubt we'll have one of those, even though it's a recession imposed by government. So after the Great Depression, which worryingly people are starting to compare the present time with, it took, I can't quite read that on my screen, it took 8 years for unemployment to return to its previous level, which was quite high already after the 80s recession, 6 years after the 90s recession, 8 years. And of course, in the process, a lot of people are left out altogether, and they're the people on the books of jobactive providers and DES providers today, people who've been unemployed for a very long time. So how do we avoid the entrenchment of high levels of unemployment? We've sent to you a high-level policy briefing from ACOSS, high level meaning very short and not detailed, with some ideas on how to avoid the entrenchment of high unemployment and high levels of long-term unemployment. And as Cass mentioned earlier, we'd very much welcome your feedback, and if you can get it back to us by email within a week, that would be fantastic. So point one is timely economic stimulus. If households and businesses aren't spending, government's going to have to step in with infrastructure investment and with expansions in services such as aged care that are labour intensive and pick up people who've lost jobs in services. And that can do a lot of good in the long run as well, both those things. We're pushing for a big social housing build, for example. Secondly, manage the huge employment restructure as the lockdowns are eased. The impact of COVID on the labour market and the lockdowns on the labour market, it's hard to compare with previous recessions. A better comparison is perhaps with wartime, where government deliberately shut down industries unilaterally, shut them down, and redirected effort into other sectors, and that's kind of what's happened here. And so there's going to be another big restructure in the labour market coming out of the lockdowns, just as there was as we went into them, and it's not going to look the same afterwards. There will be businesses that will lay more people off so that they can reduce their debt levels, and there isn't enough demand in the economy, and exports are going to be pretty weak for a while, including so-called education exports, i.e. universities. So what we're suggesting is that we really need a partnership between government, employers, unions, community, and service providers where there's a shared commitment to keep people in jobs who've got them, to ensure any vacancies that come up are open, that we don't rebuild off the back of the informal economy, that as many jobs as possible are open, and including open to the people we're most concerned about, people who are unemployed long term, young people who had the misfortune of entering the paid workforce in 2020. If there aren't open vacancies there, then long-term unemployment will rise quickly. And finally, to quickly match the right people to the right jobs and provide the training that people need. So all of those systems will have to be a lot more agile, which means, among other things, they'll need, in our view, they'll need more resources. And assemble and share real-time labour market data, which the Employment Department's attempted with its Jobs Hub. I don't think there are that many jobs up there, but I think it's a great initiative. And both national and regional coordination to match people to jobs, to training, and to keep an eye on where skill shortages might be emerging and where unemployment is becoming particularly high and entrenched. And related to that, more of a focus on career advice and support, less emphasis on the work first approach that we've had in recent years. And finally, how do we avoid entrenchment of long-term unemployment? And in my first slide, I argued we can't forget the 800,000 people who are already in the system. And there'll be a big push, I'm sure, to look after the people who've become newly unemployed, especially those young people who've become newly unemployed, who could be scarred for some time if they don't have a successful transition from education to paid employment. But let's not forget the people who were already in the system, and they are of diverse ages, and 2/3 of them were already on income support for over 12 months. So one option to assist them is some form of jobs and training guarantee for people who are unemployed long term. And one of the reasons we're thinking of this is that it's a way of ensuring that that group isn't forgotten, that they're not set aside, that an effort is made each year to invest in those people to help them secure a job, overcome their barriers to employment in whatever way is needed by each individual. And given that long-term unemployment's likely to rise pretty dramatically in a year's time, we've got to find a way to scale that up. And so one suggestion is annual credits to the employment fund for this purpose instead of just one credit, and then that you have to make do with that for the rest of your unemployment spell, even though the providers can move money around a bit from person to person. And another suggestion, though this would take a bit longer to implement, is building local partnerships to assist people with, particularly to assist people with complex needs and in those high unemployment regions. So that, for example, there are regional trials underway as part of the Next Employment Services system. We could use that model or a different one, but for people who have complicated lives and complicated needs, a number of service providers need to get together and work with employers to do what's needed to help them into employment. Secondly, can we bring forward elements of the future employment services without a disruptive national tender? So at present, the new system's supposed to come on stream in 2020. That was all envisaged at a time before COVID, before all of this happened. And yet some of the main changes that were recommended by the panel are probably needed more than ever, such as the shift from compliance to agency, both for job seekers and for providers, more payments for providers upfront as distinct from outcomes, so that that patient investment that's needed for people unemployed long term can be undertaken, and the providers know there's a revenue stream there. And if there are annual credits to the employment fund, it does need to be spent on more substantial help for people. And finally, it's important to set up a system with much lower caseloads for people long-term unemployed or at risk. And so at this point, I'll hand over to Peter, who has a few things to say as well.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Look, I thought, I was just going through some of the questions and answers there, and one of the questions we've got there is, what are the best things we can do now to prepare for supporting young people into employment? Because there's been a lot of commentary in the media that's focused particularly on young people and how they are hit really hard in recessions, and they're the first people to lose their jobs and the last ones to get them back. And with this particular case, they're also working in industries that have been hit very, very hard. So, they've kind of had a double whammy there. So your question is, what are the best things we can do now to prepare them to help them get back into employment? I know also that a lot of them are not eligible for JobKeeper too, because many of them have not been employed for 12 months, and in casual work. So that's been another reason why many of them have lost their work in proportion to other groups, other age cohorts. So I personally would have liked to have seen more young people being able to be eligible for the JobKeeper payment. And a lot of them have been excluded from it. But there's also been lots of calls, amongst different commentators that we need to urgently invest in their skills. I saw a suggestion about making, free TAFE training available, and maybe waiving, tertiary education fees, for the coming 12 months or so, to make sure that they are, if they can't get work, that they're able to get back into work or study. Another thing I think I read recently, put out by Jeff Borland, was that based on the last recession, young people who were in full-time study or had a tertiary qualification fared much better in terms of getting back into employment compared to people, I think, who didn't have Year 12 and who didn't have post Year 12 qualifications. So I think it's really important that people have that we're investing in their skills, but we're also investing in job opportunities for them. Some other suggestions have been, like having paid internships, and some of the other suggestions that you mentioned, Peter, like a jobs in training guarantee, and maybe targeting young people, particularly long-term unemployed people, through procurement, government procurement. So,
should we jump in with another question there?
Yeah.
Let's do one more question, and then we should probably pass to Debra after that for the wrap up. But the last question is, could you speak to the livability of the pre-COVID youth allowance Newstart payment? What does the COVID increase say about the livability, and what are the views on the possibility of the payment being stripped back post-COVID?
Yes, I'll answer that one. The job seeker payment pre-COVID was around $280 a week. You might get, if you're lucky, another $70 a week in rent assistance. So it's a little over $40 a day for people. And we know and have known for a long time that that isn't enough to live on. And it not only affects people's ability to feed themselves and to stay housed, it affects their ability to search for employment. And so ACOSS has been banging on about this, and many community organisations, the sector as a whole, has been banging on about this for 4 or 5 years now at least. And we think we're collectively starting to have an impact, because the government has had to acknowledge that the payment is way too low, and they've doubled it. What they've then said is, oh, that's a temporary measure, and it'll go back to where it was at end of September. However, we're getting indications from ministers that that view is softening a little. And so we aim to keep the pressure on government to permanently increase the job seeker payment way above $40 a week. And there are a few other things that are needed too in the income support system, including a lift to rent assistance, for example. So let's keep up the pressure.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter. I'll pass it over to Debra now.
Thank you. A very, very quick wrap up. First of all, to acknowledge and say thank you to the two Peters. It's certainly challenging times in many ways. So to do a presentation like this with using Zoom has been an interesting exercise for all of us. So well done. I also want to give a shout out to Penny, Brendan and Danny, who are behind the scenes, whose faces you can't see, but you can see their names. They're the three people who have kept it all running behind the scenes, and they've done an incredible job. So well done, you three. So thank you for that. Peter Davidson mentioned something that Cass said earlier. She did say it, but she only said it to a few of us. So I'm saying to the rest of you, with a week's time limit, we want you to have some robust discussions back amongst your own folk, and we think that the best ideas come out of being generated from some robust discussions and debates, and that collectively ideas can be grand from those sort of settings. We have a rare point in time where we may be able to bring forward ideas, thoughts and innovations in ways that we've never thought possible before. And I think if that collective energy can be directed sharp, fast and hard over the next week, it's both ACOSS and Jobs Australia's commitment that we will do our best to represent those ideas and put them into the melting pot, because we do think that there's a lot of dynamic thinking out there amongst you all. So you know how to find our emails and websites, so I'm not going to give you any addresses. I'm just going to say, everybody stay well, stay healthy, and thanks enormously for joining us today, both ACOSS and Jobs Australia.
And a thanks to me, from me to all of you as well. Thanks, Debra. We do want to hear from you with your best ideas. Think big, think, you know, outside where we've been in the past, because I know this is a group of people who all really care about preventing the kind of ravages of unemployment that we know can be really terrible for people. And so this is a moment for us to try and do it very differently. So again, thank you to everybody, and we'll hopefully be hearing from you some more, and vice versa. Thanks all.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Peter G's.